Today is June 2, 2017, and before we begin, let's ask our Heavenly Family to give us genuine knowledge. Heavenly Family, thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you for the simple, wonderful things in life, things to uplift us and to give us courage and to give us joy. And also thank you for the deep and profound and wonderful things that we are so privileged to behold out of the messages that you've sent through inspiration. Please help us tonight to better understand those messages. Help us to learn how to learn, and help us to rid ourselves of all preconceived ideas, all false preconceived ideas, and to rid ourselves of all of the methods of folly. So grant us wisdom, bind us together in love, and help us to advance rather than retrograde.
Amen.
Toda, thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen. True that.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm glad that we've had the privilege of advancing in our community rule studies lately, in that we've been able to actually focus on it for a decent amount of time. Of course, in the past, when we have been studying it and then have to depart to enter into another subject for a while, that's always been good. And I know Teresa's editing a bunch of studies related to one of those scenic detours. And so, yeah, it'll be nice when we have some of that stuff on YouTube, which is definitely on the way. So for tonight's study, though, we'll be continuing on the community rule, and we'll follow our regular order, our 3 stages, first being recapping what the community rule is, why it's important, and our methods of study. Second, questions and comments broadly related to the community rule. And third, our line-by-line investigation of its contents. So first, the community rule is a very important ancient Hebrew text written in the first part of the 2nd century BCE, so about 200 years before Jesus. And it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and is recognized to be one of the most important documents in that collection. And so, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we've talked about many times in the past, represents a library, or at least the preserved part of a library that belonged to an ancient group of Jews living on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran. This group of Jews had many things in common with the early followers of Jesus. More accurately, though, the early followers of Jesus had many things in common with that group of Jews, because, of course, this group of Jews came first. And they are known by most scholars as Essenes. They're one of the most well-known types of Judaism of the time. So you had Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And, of course, other groups of Jews, the Nazarenes, the Zealots, and there were actually many other groups. And out of all the groups of Jews, when you look at the followers of Jesus and you compare them to other groups, there's a lot of differences. Like, you look at the Sadducees, and the Sadducees and the Nazarenes were very, very, very different. Like, so much so that it's hard to define it as one quote-unquote religion, which is why people refer to Judaisms of the Second Temple period rather than Judaism, because there was no one monolithic thing called Judaism. There were many different ways to be a Jew, and people had different perspectives on what that meant. And so they had different ways of keeping the law, different ways of viewing God, and different beliefs about nearly everything. And so, Sadducees were very different from Nazarenes. Nazarenes different from Pharisees. Pharisees different from Zealots. And, all these groups differed from each other on significant points. And when you compare the Nazarenes with all of these various groups and try to identify something that is most similar, or something that in some way ended up being a predecessor to the Nazarene movement, without a doubt, the one that stands out the most is the Dead Sea Scroll sect. The sect of Jews referred to within the unique writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when I say unique writings, what I mean is that these writings are singular to the movement that produced it and were actually written or composed within that community. So, of course, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have books like Isaiah, but Isaiah was written long before the Dead Sea Scroll community itself had begun. But writings like the Community Rule, on the other hand, did not pre-exist the community. The Community Rule is a unique, quote-unquote, sectarian document. The reason why I say quote-unquote is because sectarian is the modern designation for the writings produced within the sect. And then there's the quote-unquote biblical documents and the quote-unquote non-biblical documents. And those would be documents that didn't end up in the rabbinic canon, but also, preceded the community and had their origin outside of the community. So, the Community Rule itself, what does it tell us? Well, it tells us a lot about the group. It tells us of their beliefs, of their practices, of their organizational structure. It is essentially something that's a mix between, something similar to a church manual, a constitution and bylaws, a fundamental beliefs, or, something like that. It's kind of a mix between all of those sorts of things, although it may precede those categories. But in function, it had a similar function to a mixture of the functions which those other texts actually play. So it's very important for understanding the community of Jews. It's also very important for understanding the early followers of Jesus, because at least some of them were certainly very familiar with it, even to the point that some scholars think that the Gospel of John, for example, had sections of the Community Rule committed to memory. I don't know whether that's true or not, but just to say that there is enough similarity between passages in the Community Rule and passages in the Gospel of John that some scholars think that the author had it memorized. It's clear that he used it in one way or another, whether it was reading it and memorizing it or having it in front of him while writing his gospel. It's hard to say, but that's just one New Testament writer that certainly was heavily influenced by the community rule. But there are other Nazarene writings, other early writings of the followers of Jesus in the first century that clearly were heavily influenced by the community rule. In the past, I've mentioned, in addition to the Gospel of John, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Odes of Solomon. But even Paul's writings and the Synoptic Gospels and the other Johannine writings, as they're called, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation, they all have a certain degree of parallels with the community rule. Some of them are strong enough and specific enough that it can be known that the author of the Nazarene text was familiar with the community rule itself. So, for anyone who's interested in Jesus, the community rule should be important. It should also be important for another reason, still in connection with Jesus, but it is yet another reason, and that being that Jesus and even John the Baptist and the leaders of the Nazarene movement to follow Jesus, namely James and Paul, and I'd include other leaders in there as well, people like Peter and John, for example. These individuals certainly viewed the founder of the Dead Sea sect, an individual known in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Teacher of Righteousness, as being a true prophet or a true messenger of God. And we know that because of several reasons, but to summarize it, we've gone through this several times in the past, but essentially there is a way by which one can test whether an individual considered a person of a previous generation to be a prophet. And it's actually quite simple. First, you'd have to find out whether they had any sort of means of being aware of that person, which, of course, Jesus certainly did have a means of being aware of the Teacher of Righteousness because, hey, the Essenes were one of the most well-known groups of Jews in their day. Essenes were around the, villages and outside of the cities throughout Judea and the land of Israel during the time. And, hey, that's where Jesus did most of his teaching. So doubtless he would have run across some of them. Jesus and John both had a Baptist-type ministry in the land of Israel and were evidently close to Qumran itself, the actual location. So certainly they knew about them. And then there's specific things in the New Testament which show Jesus interacting in some way with ideas that are found only among the Essenes. Like, for example, in one particular sectarian document, there's a command for all Essenes that if an animal is in a pit on the Sabbath day, they cannot help it out. To do so in the eyes of the Essenes would be to break the Sabbath. Now, Jesus, there's a passage in at least one of the Gospels, I'm not sure whether it's in more than that, but in one of the Gospels at least, Jesus is speaking to a group of fellow Jews, as he usually does, and he says, "Who among you," this is how it's normally translated anyway, "who among you, if he saw an animal in a pit on the Sabbath day, would not help him?" Now, some scholars say that it's actually more accurately translated, "There are some among you who, if an animal was in the pit on the Sabbath, they would not help him out or help the animal out. Well, and the reason why, of course, it typically wouldn't be translated as "there are some among you" is because prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, people thought, oh, this must be totally hypothetical, metaphorical, whatever, because, come on, any Jew would help an animal out of the pit on a Sabbath. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that wrong, and Jesus was actually recognizing there are some here among you who wouldn't help an animal out of a pit on the Sabbath, and his point was that obviously that doesn't make sense. You should help the animal. It's totally in keeping with the purpose of the Sabbath to do so, and to not do so would actually be a violation of the law of God. And so that is Jesus specifically interacting with individuals who doubtless were part of the Essene movement. So we know for sure that he knew them, that he was in contact with them. There are other things in the Dead Sea Scrolls which have a positive contact, like that's kind of a negative contact where Jesus is disagreeing with something that's in one of these Dead Sea Scrolls. But then you also have positive contact. For example, when John the Baptist was in prison, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask him, "Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" And then Jesus replied, he said, "Go and tell John what you see and what you hear. The sick are healed, the lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised, and the gospel is preached," and so on and so forth. Okay, so how does that answer John's question? It sounds kind of like Jesus is referring to a passage in Isaiah where it talks about the lame walking, the blind seeing, and the gospel being preached. But it doesn't mention anything in Isaiah about the dead being raised by this individual. But there is a document that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that gives the list just as it is in the New Testament, including raising the dead. And it says that the one to do these things is the Messiah. And it's not just any old Messiah. Like in the Hebrew Scriptures, for example, there's lots of Messiahs. A Messiah is just someone who's anointed. It means anointed one. But this text, this Dead Sea Scroll fragment says, "The heavens and the earth shall listen to his Messiah." Okay, so this is like, his Messiah, God's Messiah, and the heavens and the earth shall listen to him. Like, this guy is a major figure. He isn't just any old Messiah. He's the Messiah. He's the one that's bringing about all these amazing things. And he does the things that this Dead Sea Scroll fragment says that he would do. So that's what Jesus was saying. Hey, look at this. These are the things that are being done. And he gives this list. Well, that does answer John's question, because this list tells what the Messiah would do. So that's pretty specific, and that's a positive contact. So what we've found in the past is that the points of positive contact between Jesus, his teachings, and the teachings of his early followers and the Dead Sea Scrolls, those positive points of contact primarily are made in relation to the earlier sectarian literature, like the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule. And then the points of negative contact are made in relationship to later Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Damascus document, for example, comes a little bit later, and that is where you find this rule to not help an animal out of the pit, which Jesus clearly disagreed with. More particularly, when you examine the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had their origin with the teacher of righteousness, that is, the founding prophet of the Dead Sea sect, there you find striking agreement between what he said, what the teacher of righteousness said, and what Jesus and his early followers were saying, to the point where they took unique ideas that were original to the teacher of righteousness and built upon them and advocated them. And one of those ideas was what historians have referred to as a cosmic light-darkness dualism. And, we've kind of referred to it in terms of morality and truth-based morality. That's one other way to refer to it. And this truth-falsehood dualism. But the idea is that everything is either working for good or for evil. Everything is true or false, light or dark. These two categories we're very familiar with in our culture because we've been influenced so much from the New Testament. But where did the New Testament authors get this paradigm? Because it's not in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's not in the Apocrypha, it's not in all of these other Jewish and non-Jewish texts that we have from the ancient world, other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it goes back to the teacher of righteousness. It's in the Thanksgiving hymns, which is his own personal hymns that he wrote, and it's in other Qumran literature that goes back to the teacher of righteousness, and it's perhaps most fully explained in the community rule. Well, that paradigm itself shows us that anyone holding to it would view a claimed prophet as either a true prophet or a false prophet, because the paradigm says that everything is either true or false. So is this prophet or this claimed prophet actually a true prophet, or are they a false prophet? Well, how would you know? Well, you look how someone deals with the unique teachings put forward by that prophet. Because, of course, you can't just compare anything that they happen to agree on and say, well, this means that one considered the other a true prophet. No, that wouldn't make sense. For example, you wouldn't take a Catholic and compare them to what Joseph Smith said, and since they both say that God exists, that you say that the Catholic must be a Mormon. Now, that wouldn't make any sense, only if the Catholic starts promoting and teaching, let's say, the Book of Mormon, or any of the unique teachings that were original to Joseph Smith, then you would say, oh, that Catholic is now becoming a Mormon, or, they believe in Joseph Smith. So that's what you have to do with Jesus and the teacher of righteousness. How does Jesus and how do the Nazarenes deal with the unique and original teachings of the teacher of righteousness? And what you find is that they advocate them. They promote them, this light-darkness dualism. And we've gone through many parallels in the past. I won't take the time to go through that right now. So that's very important for anyone interested in Jesus. If he actually considered any individual previous to him to be a true prophet, well, having the writings of that individual would certainly be helpful in understanding who Jesus was and what he was about. So, for instance, we know that Jesus considered Isaiah to be a true prophet. Well, it sure is useful to have the book of Isaiah in order to understand Jesus. If you didn't have the book of Isaiah or the book of Daniel or the Psalms, let's say you don't have Daniel, the Psalms, Isaiah, or Deuteronomy. These are the writings that Jesus quotes the most. Well, it'd be pretty hard to understand what Jesus was saying because he's basing a lot of what he was saying on those writings. So it's the same with the community rule. The early followers of Jesus evidently based certain things on the community rule and on the Thanksgiving hymns and these sectarian writings from this Qumran group. particularly the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. So having these writings is really important in understanding Jesus and the Nazarenes. There's another parallel that I want to draw with these other texts like Isaiah and the community rule, though, and that is that Isaiah is not just useful as background material for the New Testament. Isaiah is also important in its own right, as are the Psalms, as are Deuteronomy, as is Daniel. Likewise with the community rule, it is important in its own right. It's not just background material. It is important because of what it has to say. What it has to say concerning organization, what it has to say concerning the law of God, morality, eschatology, predictive, prophetic things. It's important in many regards on its own. And so we've been studying it, trying to understand first what are its claims, and in order to do that, we try very hard not to import our own understandings and interpretations into what we take to be the meaning of the community rule. We read it in light of its time and place and setting. So, for example, if we read something that it says, we won't say, oh, this is talking about, something in the future from it that it didn't specifically know about. Like, oh, this is talking about the 1,000 years in the book of Revelation. Well, the book of Revelation wasn't written yet, so it couldn't have been actually referring to that. The author of this text could not have had that in mind. Yet we will bring in these other texts for comparison and to really to put ourselves in check to make sure that we are judging the community rule using the same principles as we use in judging any other text. So that's the first thing, to try and correctly understand the claims put forward by the author or authors of the community rule. The second thing is simply to test those claims. Are they true? Are they in harmony with reality? If they are not, well, then we don't really have a need of them. If they are, then wonderful. Perhaps we can learn something. Two of the claims which we are most interested in finding out are, first, what does the community rule claim for itself concerning its origin? As in, does it claim divine inspiration as its origin? Or is it just claiming to be the opinions and thoughts of 2nd century BCE Jews? Second, we want to know its moral claims. What does it claim concerning morality and the remedy for immorality? Why is that so important to us? Because that is really the number one issue in the world, in life. Selfishness, immorality is what causes the most suffering and wrong in this world. And we really do want to bring an end to all of that. So if this advocates a right moral system and a remedy for immorality, then we want it and we need it. And in addition to those two claims, we want to understand any claim, whatever claim the community rule is interested in putting forward. And, of course, part of the process of seeking to understand the community rule in its own right is to gain a grasp for what points it is interested in bringing forth. Or accurately said, what were the points its author or authors were most interested in bringing forth. We want to know what those claims are, and we want to test those claims. And if we were to study and find out it doesn't let us know whether it claims inspiration and it doesn't comment on morality, well, then we wouldn't try to force a comment from it on those subjects. But it's just saying that those are two things that we always have in mind when studying any text. And so far we have found that it certainly does advocate a moral system, which is a truth-based moral system. And it also comments extensively on the remedy for immorality, which it says to be a knowledge of the truth. And this is what we have found to be correct in this message. So that said, does anyone have any comments or questions broadly related to the community rule?
I had a hard time getting my phone out of my pocket. Anyway, I was thinking when we were talking about the ox in the ditch, that maybe it wasn't a life and death issue for the animal. One day in the ditch, wouldn't make it die or anything. So that was my thought. That maybe that's why they said better to keep the Sabbath and get the animal out on Sabbath. The animal wasn't going to die. Because we've had cows stuck in the brush for longer than a day. We didn't know it, but they didn't die.
Well, something of note in the Gospel of John is that there's one instance. I'm trying to remember if the man was blind or if he had a crippled hand or something like that. But Jesus, hand, okay. Yeah, Jesus went specifically to heal him on the Sabbath. He could have healed him on another day, but he chose to heal him on the Sabbath in order to show that the Sabbath is about relieving people. It's actually a positive thing to do on the Sabbath. So, the guy would have lived. He had that that problem for a long time. He would have been fine in a sense, but Jesus had the perspective that he would relieve suffering on the Sabbath. And even if an animal's not going to die, I know I sure wouldn't like to be stuck in a pit all day, and I'm sure an animal wouldn't like to be stuck in a pit all day either. And so Jesus' perspective was, go and help the animal. Whereas the perspective outlined in the Damascus document is just let it cry all day. It'll be there, maybe it'll be crying out,
Maybe its leg's broken, but hey, that's just too bad.
Yeah. And so, the fact is it doesn't say, but if it's a death issue, life and death, then go and help it. No, it's just, hey, don't go help it because that would break the Sabbath. When Jesus is saying it won't break the Sabbath. So it is a genuine conflict between those two expressions. So, anyway.
I'll say one thing on that too. I'm so glad for the example in the Gospels of what Jesus taught. Because if we didn't have the record of him purposely healing a man's hand on the Sabbath, or anything else along those lines, it would be really easy to see people taking the same mindset that, oh, no, Sabbath is too holy to heal anybody or help anybody's suffering.
Sure.
It would be so easy for that to happen. And that's, that idea, I've kind of held to as well in the past, like to whatever degree, I haven't understood it as well as it seems like I'm understanding it much better. And largely because of the Dead Sea Scroll find and noticing that contrast there, the conflict. But when I think about taking that perspective now, it just turns my stomach.
Oh, yeah.
It just seems like such a proud thing to do, self-righteous thing to do, So I'm so grateful for Jesus' example because if we didn't have it, there would be those who wouldn't necessarily not help someone or an animal because of pride. They would genuinely do it because they might think sincerely that that's what we're supposed to do because of tradition or some other. To say the Damascus document actually was the thing that survived, So that's what everybody thought. Well, there's different reasons why people might hold to that idea, and I'm just so glad that we don't have to wonder.
Absolutely. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, it doesn't sound like there are any more comments or questions, so we will continue on our line-by-line investigation of the community rule. We are basing our study of the community rule primarily, at least so far, on a particular copy of it known as 1QS. This is the best preserved copy of the community rule among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was also the first copy that was found. It has 11 columns of text, and we are currently in the 4th. Starting at about column 3, line 12 or 13, the community rule begins to describe the teaching of the two spirits, or the two principles, that of truth and falsehood. And in column 4, it describes the ways in which those two spirits are manifested in the world and the outcome of following one spirit or another. Until we get to line 15 or so, and then it describes the conflict between these two principles and how truth will eventually reign. So I think that we're actually discussing the last few lines here. We're at about line 24. I'll just read this last paragraph. And when I say paragraph, I'm referring to the paragraph as it is in Giza Vermes' translation, or Geza Vermes, I think is more accurate. So this is what it says. Until now, the spirits of truth and falsehood contend in the minds of men. They walk in wisdom or in folly. According to his portion of truth and righteousness, so does a man hate falsehood, and according to his inheritance in the lot of falsehood, so is he wicked and so hates truth. For God has established the two spirits in equal measure until the determined end, and until the renewal. And he knows the results of their deeds for all time. He has allotted them to the children of men, that they may know good and evil, and that the lot of all the living may be according to their spirit in the day of their appointed visitation. So, last time, I believe we discussed the first sentence. Is that correct? Until now, the spirits of truth and falsehood struggle in the minds of men. They walk in wisdom or in folly. I think that's where we ended. So, the next sentence, I'll read it again, and then you guys can comment or if you have questions concerning it. According to his portion of truth and righteousness, so does a man hate falsehood. And according to his inheritance in the lot of falsehood, so is he wicked and so hates truth. Any comments?
Sounds like the more truth we have, the more we'll hate falsehood, and vice versa. Like it's definitely, a proportional thing.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it's, a pretty straightforward sentence. It's describing how proportions of truth and righteousness relate to the degree of hatred for falsehood, and proportions of falsehood correspond to the degree of wickedness and hatred for truth. It's also quite interesting because this is yet another statement which definitely connects falsehood with wickedness and truth with righteousness. In other words, it is a truth-based moral system. That's just another thing to note, that this states it so very plainly. So what do you guys think? Is that, well, first I just want to ask, does everyone agree with that in terms of understanding that what it is saying is that the more truth and righteousness someone has, the more hatred for falsehood that person will have, and likewise, the more falsehood someone has, the more that person will be wicked, and the more that person will hate truth? Do you guys all agree with that, or does anyone have a different understanding?
That's what it sounds like to me, too.
Excellent. All right. Well, since no one is saying anything other than that, then, I like I said, I think that that's pretty straightforward. I don't expect anyone to disagree with that. So the next question is, what do you guys think? Is that a true claim? Is that true, or is that not true, that the degree of truth and righteousness corresponds to the degree of hatred for falsehood and vice versa?
I feel like I need to think about that more. So I don't feel like I can answer that yet.
Yeah, I would agree. It's almost like one end, you want to say, yeah, you're applying those measures, but at the other end, your heart is being softened where you have more compassion and understanding, and so it also, I would think, would lead to some kind of discretion of awareness that may not be as extreme.
Okay. So, I would say that it makes sense, if someone, I'll relate this to my personal experience. The more truth I understand, the more I hate falsehood. without a doubt. It's partly because I can discern falsehood more easily, and I can discern its character more vividly. So that's definitely that's been my experience for sure. How an increase of truth definitely corresponds to an increase of hatred for falsehood. And likewise, I can say that the points in my experience where I have been most embedded in falsehood, I have definitely had the most hatred for truth. Not that I necessarily recognized it as truth, at least not in an overt sense, but yeah, I definitely hated truth. So I'll just say that my experience certainly agrees with this, not that one's own experience is always the best way to test something. Also, I'll say that intuitively it makes sense. And I'll say also, though, that I have definitely seen this to be the case in others. That the more someone understands truth, the more they hate falsehood. The less someone understands truth, and the more falsehood they have, the more they hate truth. So I think that it's one of those things that we can observe readily.
I agree with the statement. And I think about like some simple examples. Like, for example, most people would agree that it's good for the police to kind of monitor traffic to save lives and that kind of thing. But when those sirens go off behind you, you suddenly hate the truth that that's a good thing. And another thing I'd just like to say, like, it seems like even in the secular world, they kind of agree with this. Like for example, Sigmund Freud and his, I think he called it id. It's been a while since I studied this, but I believe the id contained, it was sort of, he called it like a vessel, and the vessel could be filled with a combination of love and hate. But it couldn't, if the vessel was a certain size, and you can only go to the, if you filled the whole vessel with love, there's no room for hate. If you filled the whole vessel with hate, there's no room for love. But it was, a confined vessel that only would allow a certain volume, and that was it. So anyway, I'm just kind of saying that, I think the secular world tends to agree with this as well, which, people thinking about this kind of thing come to the same conclusion that the teacher of righteousness has come to here.
Yeah, very interesting. It makes me think that there's probably some degree of influence, of course, indirectly, but it's just that this whole paradigm, of course, was picked up by the early followers of Jesus, and then it was advocated, and that has influenced so much of the Western world. And so, I do think that a lot of people, honestly, I don't really think that most people in the Western world would read this and think, no, that's not the case. Most people would probably read it and be like, yeah, that makes sense, whether they've thought of it in those terms or not. And then those who have thought about it more clearly would probably agree with it. Yeah, I think you're right on that. Any other comments or questions on this sentence?
Well, this is almost stating the obvious, but again, it really emphasizes the importance to learn as much truth as possible, because as we've all been stating, the more we know the truth, the more we hate falsehood. So if we find ourselves recognizing that we actually still enjoy sin to whatever degree, if we still enjoy falsehood, but we recognize that that's not a good thing, then the remedy is to fill our minds with as much truth as possible.
Amen. Well put.
When we see what the truth is doing to us and has done to us, we want to run from it.
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure if I got you. Could you repeat it?
I say, when we realize what the truth or what the error has done to us, how we made bad decisions, makes us want to run to the truth, and be set free. We didn't realize what the falsehood was doing to us. We didn't realize we were in falsehood.
Yes, yeah, that's certainly the case. Very often, people are becoming destroyed by lies that they tell themselves, and they don't realize how much they're damaging themselves. And we've all done this to varying degrees, but of course, like depression is a really good example, or like if someone's really self-depreciating or just feeds a lot of negativity into their own life, well, then they just end up, messing everything up for themselves, really, because they're feeding themselves falsehood and just ruining things. When if they fed themselves truth, then, hey, they would be able to move forward and wouldn't be destroying themselves and have a far more positive experience. So, yeah, we need to be awakened to the negative effects of falsehood, which, of course, understanding the truth raises our awareness of falsehood and its effects. And once we understand those effects, we need to really, run to the truth faster and faster. So we must advance and not retrograde.
Amen.
Even in our diet, I wish I could have known the truth of vegetarianism long before I did, because I had a serious health problem just because I was eating wrong.
Yeah, knowing the truth of just about anything will help us with that thing, and health is a good example. When people have, some other examples are crossing my mind in relation to this. So people who may love a certain falsehood in relation to health, like they really want a certain thing to be the solution. Or, I'll give an example that pretty much anyone listening to this will get this example. So there's like TV faith healers, and there's this guy, Peter Popov. He was exposed a long time ago now as being fraudulent and basically just totally using people for their money and pretending like he could heal them and putting on a show, and people really believed that he had these special abilities to heal them. And, he was a pseudo-Christian faith healer. And people would really buy into this falsehood, and if someone was to come to them and say, hey, look, he's a fraud, they would hate that truth. And there were people who definitely hated that truth. And I'll give an example of that more specifically. And so, this is what would happen. He would go and supposedly heal someone and tell them to throw away their medication. And so they would throw away their medication. And, And, of course, sometimes it was medication that was genuinely helping them, and they would throw it away because they believed that they were healed by this faith healer. And some people, of course, are damaging themselves and dying because they're believing falsehood. They believe they're healed when they're not. And so what happened eventually was this guy was exposed on national television and ended up going to jail. But when he was exposed, the television program that broadcasted this received a whole bunch of letters in the mail from Peter Popoff's supporters, and they're all supporting him. And it was like a really, really obvious thing. Like, he had an earpiece in, and James Randi and a private detective went and tapped into the radio signal and heard his wife talking to him through this earpiece, giving him this information. Like, he would stand up in front of the crowd and call out a name, and he'd say, "Hey, you have this disease, don't you?" And the person would be amazed, like, "Oh, wow, God revealed to him my name and where I live and my health issue and all of that." When really it's just his wife telling him this information through an earpiece, because she had gone around before the camera started rolling and talked to people, and someone else wrote down their information, and they filled out information cards, and they had all this information on people, and she just was telling him through an earpiece, and it sounded really amazing. So they exposed him. They found this, and they played on national TV his program with what he heard his wife telling him through his earpiece. So it was just totally obvious, like anyone could see it, unless they just hate the truth. So the people who sent in letters voicing their continued support for Peter Popoff obviously hated the truth because of how much falsehood they bought into. Like, they really bought into some serious falsehood, and so they hated the truth just that much more. And of course, after he got out of jail, he started doing the same basic things, selling miracle water and so on, and people to this day are buying miracle water from a convicted fraud. And so easy to show. And another example is there were some elderly women who were Roman Catholic of the very traditional sort. You know how, like, in Roman Catholicism, certain strands of it are very much so focused on relics and miraculous objects and, like, weeping statues of the Virgin Mary and different things like that. So there's this one place where there's this tree, and the tree was, these women were standing or kneeling or whatever under this tree and praying, and then they started to get these drops on their faces, and they believed it was a miracle. It was the tears of Jesus falling on their face. And so people thought, oh, that's interesting. What's up with this? So some people started looking into it, and this one guy who, was knowledgeable about different organisms and so on went and investigated it, and he found out that it was actually these little bugs who were actually peeing on these women. Mm. And so they told the women. They told them what it was, and they said, well, that's the natural explanation. We believe that it's the tears of Jesus. And so they kept on going under this tree
to get peed on.
Thinking,
wow.
Fooling themselves, and pretending like it's the tears of Jesus in essence, because they knew better. But they didn't like that truth. They didn't like the fact that it was just bugs peeing on them. They preferred to believe that it was the tears of Jesus. Oh, this is just showing how much people can reject and hate even the obvious truth, even the demonstrated truth, because of a love for falsehood. Whereas, if someone really loves truth, they will really hate that falsehood. Like if someone loved truth and they were getting peed on by bugs thinking it was the tears of Jesus, and then they found out, they would hate the fact that they were fooled into thinking that it was the tears of Jesus when really they were just getting peed on by bugs. And they would probably feel rather ashamed and, learn something from that. So how we approach correction and our own beliefs and all of that makes a huge, huge difference. Anyway, I'm looking at the time here, and we should bring the meeting to an end within the next 20 minutes or so. So does anyone have other questions or comments in regard to what we're discussing?
I have a comment. I was just looking at that 2 Thessalonians 2:10, that people aren't saved because they don't have a love of the truth. And so it seems like in addition to just your proportion of truth, or the amount of truth that you have, that you would hate falsehood, does that affect your love of the truth as well? Because that verse in 2 Thessalonians makes it sound like, like you might need to cultivate a love of the truth instead of just the amount of truth that you have. Does the amount of truth you have make you love it more? I mean, that's my question.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yes and no. That's a really good question, by the way, but yes and no. But in general, the first aspect, yes, this whole thing does relate to the love of truth, to not just the proportion of truth. But the reason why I say yes and no is because the amount of truth you have does increase your love for the truth if you love the truth. But if you choose not to allow your increase of truth to cause you to fall more in love with it, then obviously you won't. So it's not like that is the thing which makes the difference, just the amount of truth. The amount of truth is not the thing which itself causes you to love it or not. It's simply your free will response to it. You could harden your heart to it, or you could resist it.
Satan sure knew a lot of truth.
I knew that you were going to give that example because I was going to give that example. We think the same. So, yeah, exactly. Lucifer, he had so much truth, in fact, more than all the other beings other than our heavenly family. But that did not equate to him loving the truth more than everyone else. He actually decided to not love the truth because he became dissatisfied with the truth of himself, with the truth of his own position in life. And so what could happen with an individual is there might be some specific truth which they don't like, or which they begin to not like. And if they run with that and dislike that one specific truth, they could end up carrying that over to a lot more and really end up despising truth as a whole. So what we have to do is learn to love all the truth which we presently have. And there are various ways in which we can do that. And the reason why I say various ways is because it applies differently in different circumstances as to how exactly we would go about gaining a love for the truth. But ultimately, like, there are a couple things that I would kind of boil it down to, and I'm not saying I'm going to express this in the best way. If I contemplate it longer, maybe I'll find better ways to kind of boil it down. And Heavenly Family just helped me to boil this down to some of its basic principles as clearly as possible. So really what it comes down to is reason. Let's say someone brings you a truth and you have an initial resistance to it. There's something about it which, let's say, in fact, I'll give something that's the more common reason why someone might dislike a truth that's presented to them. It's that they know or even just suspect that the results in their own life of accepting that certain idea as true will put them in a place that they don't want to be in. And very often that is socially, where someone comes across a certain idea and they might resist it because they know, oh, if I accept that idea, then that means I'll be like this, and what will my friends think of me? What will my family think of me? Or, oh, will I have to do this and do that, and obligations, or change, basically changing their behavior in one way or another. People don't want to have to change their behavior, and people don't want to be socially isolated. So if it's an idea that is just not generally accepted within the groups in which they place themselves mentally, like if they consider themselves to be part of a certain group and that group does not generally favor a certain idea, then they will be most likely inclined to not favor that idea because it goes against the group that they're a part of, and if they accept it, then they could be socially isolated. So that's the one aspect. And the other aspect is, simply changing things in their life, like changing behavior, or if there's something that they enjoy that they think they might have to give up, well, then they won't accept the truth, most likely. But notice, these are responses based on feelings, based on emotion. And so someone might not like that truth because of typically those two things. Don't want to have to change, don't want to have to be socially isolated, and the idea is not accepted within the group or groups in which they place themselves. So, what to do? Well, if in that moment they apply reason, and I just really think about it straightforwardly. Let's just take the first one. Here's this truth. If I keep eating high-carb foods, I'm going to become overweight and, increase risk for a plethora of diseases and probably die younger than I should. Okay, well, I don't want to have to change, if someone tells me that, someone's talking to me saying, oh, well, look, you have to change this about your diet, you have to exercise, you have to do all these things, otherwise you're going to keep gaining weight and you're going to have all these problems. Well, someone might, I don't want to hear that, don't tell me that, they might totally hate that truth just because they're going to have to change something, and they enjoy their chocolate and their ice cream and their, pasta. So, don't want to have to hear that. I'm not going to do that because I want to, quote unquote, enjoy life. Well, if they simply stop to reason for a moment that, hey, wait a second, first, is that actually true? Well, okay, if I can determine that that's true and that it's actually going to have these negative effects on me, then it would actually be really foolish. It would be quite stupid, a really bad idea, even just from a selfish perspective, to continue to indulge in these things which are really damaging me, because I'm actually going to be suffering in the long run, and I'm going to regret it. So employing that little bit of reason could cause someone to say, you know what, in spite of the fact that I enjoy indulging in these things right now and don't want to have to exercise and eat right and all of that, I'm going to do it anyway, because it's simply true that it's going to damage me if I don't. So let's say they start doing that, and let's say they lose 40 pounds and are healthy. Well, guess what? They are now going to love that truth because they feel better. They have a far better quality of life. Their confidence and their self-esteem is up. They're not, feeling crappy all the time. It's like, hey, life is better now, and they have better prospects for their future because they're not going downhill. They're going uphill. It's getting better. So they will now love that truth because they can see that it actually makes a difference in life. It actually opens up the wonders and benefits of life to live according to truth. So following truth, living according to truth, and doing that through reasoning when you hear the truth is what will cause someone to really love the truth. And so, they could do that when it comes to that sort of issue. And then when it comes to another sort of thing that's dealing with social isolation and not wanting to accept certain truth because of their social group, well, what often takes place is that when someone ends up accepting an idea that they recognize as true, even though it's against their social group, what often takes place is that people then realize who their true friends are.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's tough at first, within a few years, people end up looking back and saying, hey, now guess what? Yeah, I'm not in that social group anymore, but now I'm in a social group that actually agrees with this group. It's not like you lose friends and there's just no one else out there. It's not like accepting truth actually socially isolates people. It does often socially isolate people from the people with whom they had formerly associated if those people reject that truth too. But it's not like there's no one out there who is going to agree with that truth. And so people end up, yes, there's a restructuring of their social life, but they end up in a better social circumstance. And those who will be their true friends, they'll recognize, like, oh man, okay, this person isn't ridiculing me because of a difference in idea. And hey, you know what? That's good. I didn't lose that friendship over this. And, now I can at least be honest with myself and honest with that person and just have a better relationship because of just walking with integrity. And they'll recognize that they're better off to lose the friends who cut them out of their life because they accepted a certain idea, because they now know that, oh man, this person, if they're really going to just push me away because I accept this idea, well then, you know what, they didn't really care for me all that much anyway. And if they're not interested in knowing truth and in talking to me about this, well then obviously it wasn't a proper friendship. So it's not like you were losing this wonderful thing, it's just that you were losing what you thought was so wonderful. So, those social circumstances can certainly be hard, but again, just given time, when people become socially isolated from a certain group, they end up recognizing that, hey, it was the better thing to do. And so they'll love that truth because, hey, and depending on what the truth is, too, it might simply be worth it to be socially isolated in order to follow that truth, because the benefits of following that truth may be so great. Like, okay, let's just say you're part of a group of hunters and fishers, and meat eating is like totally like all the time, all the way, and you decide to be vegetarian because you don't want to promote death to animals, and you become socially isolated. Well, it might just be better, for you in terms of your conscience, in terms of a whole bunch of other things in life, to just not eat meat anymore. Or let's say it was that you accepted the branch message and became vegetarian, and now you're socially isolated from all of your hunting and fishing buddies and whatever. Well, you know what? What would be better, to just keep hunting and fishing and eating meat, and to, let's say, reject the branch message and lose out on everything that the branch message has to offer, or to accept the branch message and, hey, even if some of your buddies don't want to hang out anymore, then that's fine. And, hey, maybe some of them will be totally cool with it, like, hey, whatever, it's all good. We all have our different ways of doing things, and to each his own. Like, maybe they'll have that perspective, and you won't lose friends over it. But, yeah, either way, simply reasoning it through and following the truth, that is what will cause someone to love the truth. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
If you're truly close friends, they generally don't. You do things together, and one person learns something, well, they all accept it. Seems like I've noticed some of that.
Really depends, for sure.
Brother Archer from Waco come to our home church in Longview here, and the people were just saying, ooh and ah, loving it. I said, where are you getting all this truth? So the last day, he showed him the Shepherd's Rod book, and he said, I'm going to lose all my friends. So only 2 of us asked him to send us more literature. But they were loving it until they heard where it came from.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happens too often, unfortunately. So we have to close off here within these next 5 minutes, really probably 4 minutes. But I just wanted to ask Mary, did that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah. I think I need to think about it more still, but that helps a ton. Thank you.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Heavenly Family. So I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to volunteer to thank our Heavenly Family for the meeting, and then we'll bring an end to it.
I will. Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for tonight's call, and we look forward to tomorrow night's call. And we just ask that you be with us, help us to deal with the falsehood that's in this world and in our life in some situations, and maybe in most of our situations. And I know in mine. And we just ask that you be with us and comfort us through the trials that we're going through. Help us to make the right decisions. Help us to always make the decision for you, and always see falsehood and avoid it at all costs. We pray for all these things in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 Amen.